So I'm going to speak in English. I'm very happy that we could do this lecture of Professor William R. Schultz, Professor Emeritus of the National Capodistrian University in Athens. I'm happy that we can welcome here Nikolaos Vlachakis, Minister Plenipotentiary for Diplomatic Affairs of the Greek Embassy in Bucharest, Professor Iliana Sakeli, also from the Capodistrian University in Athens, Claudius Virhi Laudat from the Hellenic Foundation, Ioana Eronim, writer, and Angela Bratsou, translator, and also Mrs. Elena Lazar, colleagues of us, friends. Before beginning, I want to give the floor to Mr. Nikolaos Vlachakis, who wants to tell us some words on behalf of the Greek embassy, who helped us very much in organizing.
Dear friends, dear guests, dear professor, dear Peter Schultz, Peter Schöger, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this organizing this seminar and all these activities we have. It's my pleasure being here today, and it's my pleasure having this lecture about Derrida, not only because of my personal interest to his philosophy and to his writings, but also for the only fact that being here in Romania, as a country which is quite close to the Greek culture and the French culture at the same time, it gives us, Derrida's philosophy gives us the opportunity of reflecting on some ideas of the modern, of contemporary philosophy, and of the contemporary literature critic also, which interconnects us, Greece, Romania, and France. Allow me to say some introductory remarks, but before that I would like also to thank the sponsor of this event today, Mr. Galanakis and his company, Mr. George Galanakis, who is one of the most active sponsors and entrepreneurs here in Romania, coming from Greece. And to welcome you also to our guests, to welcome them in Bucharest. Just a few words. What is the impressive and I'm expecting from professor here today to hear about the creative writing. What makes me always to admire the Derrida's philosophy? It is this all this terminology he has introduced to the contemporary philosophy, having all this terminology regarding the grammatology, the semiology, or the genealogy of the writing, all these basic terms that he has used, which connects us with the very basic concepts of the Greek language. So somehow Derrida is not only a French philosopher, but it is in his metaphysical, or at least at his semiological appearance, he is something. He's a global philosopher, and being a global, of course, he goes very deeply to the roots of this of the ancient Greek philosophy, and I remember him when I first met. First time I heard a lecture by him in the French Institute in Athens when I was a student of philosophy, and I discovered for first time his philosophy of writing, he has developed there the concept of deconstruction. I was quite skeptical on this concept, and I'm still skeptical on the utility of this term. Maybe the philosophical dispute that has arisen from this deconstruction concept, it is quite challenging and always interesting. But I always have some doubts on that, and I will keep having them. But this is always the reason for what we can reflect on his philosophy. I would like also to say that his concept about difference, διαφορά and διαφορά, as we translate it in Greek. This is connected with transcendental signifying as something which underlines the importance and the meaning of the postponement in the time, the postponement of the writing in the time, the postponement of the meaning. This is something which really many times I have thought on this postponement as something which happens and it occurs in the time, and at the same time the difference, the concept of difference is connected with the space. So these bipolars, let's say, these binary oppositions between space and time, difference and difference, the transcendentality of the language and the reality of the language, the absence and the presence, all these binary oppositive schemes, I think these are the really challenging concepts in his philosophy. And I'm very glad to hear today the way the creative writing is arising among all these concepts. So I don't want to talk more on that. Thank you very much for this idea, this perfect idea, Peter. It was really an excellent idea being here with good friends coming from Greece and from Bucharest. Professor, thank you for your coming and for your lecture. It is always, on behalf of the Greek campus, I would like to underline that it is always a pleasure assisting in these activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nicholas Vlachakis. Before we start and give the floor to Professor William Schultz, I want to tell you something about his biography. He completed 30 years of teaching and service at the Department of English Language and Literature at the National Kapodistrian University in Athens. Between 1989 and 2020, he is now a Professor Emeritus of this university. He primarily taught the theory of culture and theory of criticism in literature. At the same time, he taught a variety of introductory courses in literature and culture, as well as science fiction. Besides teaching, he served as the director of the combined postgraduate MA and PhD program for 2 years, the director of the laboratory, a member of the library committee, a member of 3-member doctoral dissertation committees and NKUA, but also at other Greek universities, a member of language proficiency examination committees for a number of years at the National School of Public Administration, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a committee member of the CASA, an examiner of the courses of his specialty for university grants for several years, and a member of examination committees for doctoral candidates and postgraduate students. We want to tell you that he wrote several books as Cassirer and Langer on Myth, an Introduction, New York Garland 2000, Genetic Codes of Culture, The Deconstruction of Tradition by Kuhn, Bloom, and Derrida, New York, Garland, Publishing, 94. Jacques Derrida, An Annotated Primary and Secondary Bibliography, New York, Garland, Publishing, 1992. Have been published and republished by world-renowned publisher, purchased by American university libraries, and became university textbook at German American universities. In addition, Professor Schultz's intellectual curiosity extended to other areas of culture, such as education, the myth of technology, and its role in the society of the future, through a series of articles and studies that have been translated into European languages and published in prestigious journals. Currently, he is completing a book on the theory of poetic creation, with the Romantic poets Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Shelley as the main examples. In October 2021, he was elected Professor Emeritus at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens unanimously. And we have also a surprise for William Schultz. Bogdan Ghiu couldn't attend this meeting here because he has awarding at the Babeș-Bolyai University Dr. Honoris Causa, but he left us a text. He's a great admirer of Derrida. And he gave us a text I read on behalf of Bogdan Ghiu, who is a poet, an excellent translator and poet, and also president of the ArtLit organization that also deals as we deal with literary translation, where Mrs. Brațu is also a member of our Fitralit. So Bogdan Ghiu says, Jacques Derrida belongs, along with Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Jean-François Lyotard, and others, to the great pleiad of so-called post-structuralist thinkers, also known as French theory. Like them, and sometimes alongside them, he was in demand and was propelled to a planetary level on the American university campus, where his theories, analysis, and concepts came to crown and philosophically ground, giving them historical weight and prolonging them over time. The contestation that we could synthetically, symbolically represent around 1968. The fact that Jacques Derrida was in demand and carried out his American teaching, through which he became known worldwide, not in the philosophy departments of American university, but especially in those of comparative literature and sometimes law, is no accident, the dominant in America being analytical philosophy, which Derrida deconstructed, in fact, with anticipation, because of logicism and its narrow rationalism, as a naive extension of the logocentrism of the metaphysical tradition. The profoundly philosophical relationship, based more on the sophist counter-tradition between Derrida's deconstruction and literature, is therefore not at all accidental. The very style of Derrida's writing being very close, intimately related to the literary, even intensely poetic regime of language. To the limit of the untranslatable of what Derrida himself called signature, i.e. idiomatic singularity, Derrida is also the author of some fundamental pages on translation as a nerve of literature. Derrida relied heavily on writers, especially poets, in his analysis and elaboration of his concept. Antonin Artaud, Francis Ponge, Paul Celan, to mention just a few of the best-known names, served as a propitious medium for him to combat the logocentric claims to power of the supposedly purely denotative language of rationalist philosophy, thought advancing according to him in a metaphorical, i.e. literary way. In Romania too, during the years of communism, as far as possible, Jacques Derrida was and continues to be more often found in the departments and faculties of letters than in those of philosophy. Given his thorough trade with literature, his vast program of opening up philosophy not only to but through literature, it is absolutely obvious that Derrida has important advice to give to present-day writers. We should also begin to discover him. So you have the floor, please.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very good introduction by both of you. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today with old Romanian friends and new ones that I'll make. It's an honor for me. I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Alina Tigo, Vice Dean of the Faculty of Foreign Languages and Literatures of Bucharest University, and to Mr. Nicholas Vlahakis for all that he has done. And I would like to thank Mr. Peter Schreiger, President of the Bucharest Department for Literary Translations of the Romanian Writers Union, and also the Union of Greeks in Romania. It's an honor to be here, and it will be great for me to share some ideas with you. Today I'm going to talk about Jacques Derrida's theory. I'm going to describe it, not really prove it, and I'm going to apply it to creative writing. And I think it'll be useful for other creators too. On the screen, you can see there a photograph of Jacques Derrida. He was probably, in the 20th century, the most famous philosopher in his lifetime. And I think he deserved it. And how do we measure fame? We measure fame by the number of publications written about him and also the quantity of his works. Those are good indications of fame. In 1990, I produced a paper, a book-length bibliography of Jacques Derrida. It was 1,000 pages in 1990. So today, after 33 more years, could it be 5,000? Could it be 10,000 pages? It's a remarkable quantity. So he had a great impact. Universities measure the quality of a professor partly by impact. And he's a philosopher with a great impact, so it'll be valuable for us to talk about him today. Here's a second photograph. He looks wily and cunning in this photograph, and he was. He was. Mythology from ancient Greece tells the future with uncanny accuracy. It prefigures both the philosophy of deconstruction by Jacques Derrida and the practice of creative writers. The best image to relate his theory with writing is the cycle of life determined by the three fates. And I have another diagram here. I'm sorry you can't see this. The painting itself is dark. You could search on the internet and you can see the image, the painting on the internet. This painting is held in the Tate Museum in London. I have seen it in person, and it's dark, but we don't have to worry about that. I have a next image of it. Homer had an idea of fate. There was only one. But Hesiod, the successor of Homer, differentiated fate into three fates. Usually they're represented as women. And in the painting, we won't look at it again, the three fates were determining the future of two lovers. They were doing that. The fates are presented in different ways in paintings or sculpture, but that doesn't concern us now. They're always women. That's kind of interesting, the fates. And there's some writing there. Here, let me describe it for you a little bit. There's a woman there, that's the first woman. There's a woman there, that's the second woman. And there's a woman there, that's the third woman. The first woman, in Greek, her name is Clotho, and she's the maker. She spins or makes the thread of life. This painting is called A Golden Thread. So she's making the thread, and the next one, her name is Lachesis, and she measures the thread. And then in this painting, the third one is sitting in the middle, and maybe you can't see it, but I can tell you, she's holding some scissors, and she's going to cut the thread of life, the golden thread. What you can't see here is that the thread is not only golden, it is also gray. So as people move through their life, they're also moving toward their death. So both occur together. And that's significant for us. The phrase, a golden thread, has become a metaphor meaning something that runs through all parts of something, holds it together, and gives it value. The golden thread of life is made or spun by Clotho and then measured by Lachesis, and it's cut by Atropos. Such a life cycle, defined in 3 stages, characterizes both Derrida's philosophy and literary works. So I'm using this as an image because people first learn by emotions and images, and then we'll move to some concepts a little bit later in the talk. Understanding it more can help writers as well as anyone in a cultural field who wishes to create new works. So I think that this would apply to some degree in mathematics or physics, chemistry, and some other traditional cultural fields. Painting, music, I think it would apply there, but we're not concerned with that today. To serve as a basis for the following discussion, I recommend that we begin with a poem and Derrida's interpretation of the poem. Derrida illustrated his deconstruction in a 1984 lecture which I attended in Buffalo, New York, on Francis Ponge's poem, Fable. He presented this poem to illustrate 2 basic features of a deconstructive reading. Let us read it and find those 2 features. So it's in the handouts, but also it's on the screen. It's not very large, but I could make it larger. Let's see, why don't we do that? Okay, this is the poem. I'll read it in English. By the word by, this text then begins, whose first line tells the truth. But this silvering beneath the one and the other, can it be tolerated? Dear reader, already you judge from this our difficulties. After 7 years of misfortune, she broke her mirror. I like that poem very much. And fable means a story that gives us some wisdom at the end. Aesop's fables. This poem is like a living organism. As both develop to complete their natures, the poem and the organism, they also develop toward their ends, their completion. In the painting, A Golden Thread, the thread was partially gray, symbolizing the opposite of life. Deconstruction looks for both the golden and the gray in the thread, uniting a literary work from the beginning to the end. As a second characteristic examined by deconstruction, the poem describes how it is made while it is being made. It is self-reflexive, or it speaks about itself. Fable speaks about its beginning in lines 1 and 2, just as it speaks about its ending in the last 2 lines. Throughout the poem, the mirror reflects the imagination of the writer. So I'll show you another image here. The purpose of this is to show you that a poem reflects the imagination of the poet. So on the left, we have imagination, and I have that image of the atom there. You can't see it very clearly. Here, let me point it there. See the image of the atom there? And below that, I have a photograph of Francis Ponge, the poet. I couldn't put the imagination inside his head. I just couldn't do it. I tried, but I couldn't do it. And on the right, here, we have the poem, Fable, and I made it as a mirror because the poem is all about a mirror. The poem is a mirror of the activity in the poet's imagination. So there's a correspondence there. And the poem is very much about that correspondence. But at the end, it's not good enough. It has become weak. So the poem has a life cycle. It's strong in the beginning, at the end it becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. Unfortunately, the poem Fable does not illustrate all the features that a complete literary work should have. As a result, deconstruction cannot be applied to it completely. Today, the definition of deconstruction has expanded so much that it means almost anything, a critique of anything. I've heard of deconstruction of recipes for cooking. And in religion, I heard George Bush use the word on television in America. So now it means almost anything. But what I'm going to give you is the original definition in 1967. And I hope I can convey some of that to you. Firstly, it only has a limited awareness of its own beginning, the poem Fable, because it does not include a critical reference to a predecessor's poem, nor does it specify its new style. I'll explain this a little bit as we go along. Like an incompletely programmed global positioning system, GPS, it does not start with an origin, and it does not have a clear destination in mind. It lacks a circle moving to show the user's position as a guide toward the destination. Then, the poet cannot see himself moving from line to line in the poem. The fable lacks a feedback mechanism for creation, which is necessary to guide the poet toward an improvement of the literary tradition. A poem cannot change the literary tradition if the poet is unaware of what this change is. So in this lecture, I'm talking about the ideal case. People can be very, very good writers, superb writers without doing this, but I'm talking about the absolutely best case, the ideal case. Secondly, Fable does not express enough about the method of its ending. It implies that the mirror is broken at the end because, as the poem progresses, the mirror gradually fails to reflect the poet's imagination accurately, leading to the end of the reflection. Deconstruction looks for the limit of a literary work or philosophy when it can no longer be creative. Then deconstruction tries to revise the end of a work to make a new start that can be creative once again. It helps the phoenix rise from the ashes. I revised my talk many times and I changed the introduction 4 times. I did include sections about how writers often express dissatisfaction with their own writing when they come to the end of their careers. And a person who's doing deconstruction should look for these because there's something there that needs to be improved. So there are clues. Writers leave clues. There's something else about literary texts that deconstruction looks for, and now let's talk about that. It's a little bit more general. In Derrida's view, authors cannot have a complete knowledge of the construction of their own works. True, they know a lot about their own works, but there's something they don't know. It might be more accurate to say that some new writer will have a superior knowledge of the earlier writer's methods. Derrida believes that the literary theory called structuralism tried to find this complete knowledge in literature. Although an author certainly does have partial knowledge of their method, a successor can learn more about any author's writing than that author knew. A new writer can learn to write better. This greater knowledge is a new law of literature. So I'm talking about the case that writers change the tradition of literature. They influence the history of literature. A new writer makes explicit a faulty law of style guiding the previous writer's works, which was only implicit in them. I use the term faulty law of style, but that's not quite the right word. In fact, I don't think exactly the right word exists because this is something different from ordinary life. We could also call it a limiting law of style because the writers were successful. They achieved what they should have achieved. They rewrote the previous authors' works. They did it better, but it comes to a limit. It comes to an end. Let's look at figure 4. I want to show you something new that deconstruction looks for in a literary work or some other work. And this says, figure 4, the origin of a perspective is outside it. This is a type of drawing. You get a piece of paper, and in the middle you draw a box. Do you see the box? Not very clearly. You draw a box, and then arbitrarily you just look for some point outside the box, and you make the point. And then you get a ruler, a straight edge, and you don't draw lines here, but you put the ruler there, or you put the ruler there. And what you do is you draw a scene or objects within this box. Here I started to draw a house. You're allowed to make vertical lines, but all the other lines must come from this point. So this is the perspective inside the box, and this is the origin of the perspective outside of it. And it's significant that the origin is a unity. It shows how all the details are oriented in the same way. And you know, too, that sometimes you can't understand something if you're just lying down. The orientation is important for understanding. The point, making an author's perspective, unites all the literary elements. They all have a common orientation or style. We speak about the Hemingway style. How do we find the unity of the style from all the details? The origin of a perspective also limits it. So that's I want to point out now that within this perspective, it's a limited perspective. It can't be specific to a person. It can't be specific in history if it isn't limited. So it's not necessarily something bad. It's just the natural course of things. Our lives are limited too. A story comes to an end, or else it is not a complete story. A story has a beginning, middle, and end. A writer's corpus, or body of works, comes to a point at which the imagination is no longer creative as it was years earlier. If you remember from the end of Wordsworth's writing, he speaks about images that don't have soul in them anymore. So he's dissatisfied, and he feels that his imagination is becoming weaker. There are many cases of this. This idea of the external origin of our perspective prepares us for a new topic, and it prepares us for the specific meaning of deconstruction in the 1960s. The perspective drawing shows the original meaning of deconstruction in the 1960s, before it became so generalized to mean almost any critique of a text. Originally, deconstruction is a double process of criticism and creation. Many people leave that out. They talk about deconstruction as a criticism of something, but at the very same time that it's criticizing, it's also creating, starting to create. The criticism of Sartre's philosophy and the creation of Derrida's grammatology from it. So that's a double process. And I have another diagram there. Let's see. Okay. This is a continuation of the previous one. Here we have this perspective again, and we have the origin of perspective outside of it. And here I want to point out that an author does know a lot about his or her own writings, and it's expressed within the text. Many authors, at point 3 there, near the end of a literary work, you'll find an apocalypse, a revelation. There you find an explanation of all the events that occurred before. Like in Shelley's Frankenstein, near the end, the monster explains the reason for the entire narrative, why everything happened. And the monster said, I'm not the monster, the scientist is the monster. And in Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent, too. At the end, we have an explanation of the 3 deaths before that. So the author knows a lot about his own works. However, a new author will come along, and a new author will be able to understand the unity of the work better than the original author did. And so deconstruction tries to unify the writing to understand it better than the writer himself or herself knew. I was going to talk about preformationism, and Derrida does speak about Proust, maybe in a discussion session if we have time. In the narrow definition of deconstruction, we can see from this figure, figure 5, Derrida unifies Sartre's philosophy, and he sees how it could become more coherent. So he finds a presupposition, and he calls it the transcendental signified. We don't need to know that now. But the most important thing is that Derrida unifies Sartre's philosophy more than Sartre knew, and he changes that presupposition into a new one. And this becomes the start of his new philosophy. And he calls this a difference. Let's move down and see that. Yeah. So if you're familiar with Sartre's philosophy, the concept near the end of being and nothingness is the fusion of the in itself and for itself. Derrida calls it the transcendental signified. We don't need to define those terms now, but what I want to point out is that Derrida unifies his philosophy and he changes it into a new postulate. He modifies it and he calls it difference. That's what I would call the narrow definition of deconstruction. And I guess I should say this, that Sartre could not have known what this is, the unity, because Derrida had to make it from a superior knowledge. So that's why he wasn't aware of it, and it didn't exist yet. Derrida brought it into existence. Derrida finds an implicit presupposition which stopped the further development of philosophy. In ancient myths, there's the myth of the clashing rocks, and a ship tries to pass through it, but these rocks stop the ship from going through. At the end of Sartre's philosophy, there is something like, at point 3, there are clashing rocks. There's a dilemma, a very difficult problem that can't be solved. So at the end of literary works, at the end of philosophical systems, we have a kind of a closure. And the new writer has to find out how to release the imagination again and make it powerful again. Has to start again in a new way. The only way to do it is in a new way. Like the Gordian knot in mythology, there's a terrible knot. You can't untie it. The only thing you can do is cut it. Derrida replaces Sartre's presupposition with this new concept of difference, laying the foundation for a new philosophy with greater unity. There are other ways to talk about the presupposition. One way is Derrida uses the terms structural unconscious because it's in the structure and the author is not aware of it. And the structural unconscious is partially implicit in a text, and yet it's partially discovered by a succeeding writer. Instead of the word discovered, we could say invented or created, because it is a new idea first conceived by a new writer, not the previous writer. The structure of Derrida's philosophy can be represented as a 3-stage process of development. So, from the narrow definition of deconstruction as this process of changing the limiting unity to a new one, a new start, a new unity. That's the narrow definition of deconstruction. I'd like to move to a broader definition of the original deconstruction as a three-stage process. The structure of Derrida's philosophy can be represented as a three-stage process of development. Recall the painting A Golden Thread with the three stages in human life. In my view, the most accurate way of defining deconstruction is to describe Derrida's criticism of Sartre's philosophy and the development of his new philosophy through these stages. I don't think that the criticism of Sartre is completed until we get to the full system of Derrida. Derrida then has a replacement philosophy, a philosophy to replace Sartre. And the same occurs in literature too. One author doesn't really revise the previous writer's works until he or she can do all that a literary work can do. Now I have a figure about the three stages of Derrida's philosophy. These are the three stages of Derrida's philosophy. I write 1, 2, 3, and in the first stage we have there, where the light is pointing, we have a criticism of Sartre's philosophy, but also we have a new concept, difference. And then, in grammatology and other works, in the middle, we have a criticism of this concept of difference, and we have a new concept, différance. And then, in the last stage, we have a criticism of différance. There's a problem with it, and we have a new concept, the supplement. So each main stage is double. It's a criticism of something that went before, and it's a new concept. And in this way, they're interconnected. I can't present the arguments to you today. I included all the passages in an appendix because they're too complicated. It would take too long, and they're too complicated. But I wanted to visually represent what happens. This pattern occurs in literature too. So,
could you explain a little for me difference and différance? Difference seems to be in English, but différance seems to be in French.
Yes.
What is the critical difference between difference and différance, for me to understand?
He created what's called a neologism. He modified the first word difference to show that it's a variation of difference. And he came up with the concept of différance because he had to presuppose it to prove the truth of difference. Philosophy has a code for the creation of its concepts and their relationships. So these concepts are very special ones. They're a priori concepts and they're dialectical concepts. So, for example, if you have chemistry, you have all these symbols, but you need rules for the combinations of the symbols too. In this case, in philosophy, even though they're ordinary words, well, différance is not such an ordinary word. Philosophy coins new terms. It has special symbols too. So, someone would have to learn the rules for the combination of these symbols, the relationships of these symbols, and that would take some time. So these are not ordinary words, they're coded terms. And there's a relationship between difference, and the supplement. And I include it in the appendix. I don't know, did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, somewhat.
It's the differentiation. This is important. We have to keep.
Yeah, I think those are the three stages of this philosophy. You find it in grammatology. I could say more about difference, but the thing is here, if you represent it accurately, these concepts do not actually have a one-to-one reference to objects in the world. These concepts have a relationship among themselves. And so later you could make some applications, but that would not be the way to define it. I have an example of difference today, a little bit later. In other words, a concept in science or a concept in philosophy belongs in a system of other concepts. So the only really accurate way to define it is to start relating difference to a lot of different concepts, like in physics or in chemistry. And it's that way in philosophy, and actually it's that way in literature too. To understand fully some aspects of a literary text, you'd have to start relating it to all the other aspects. It's systematic. So instead of being related one-to-one, difference to some object in the world, it's just related among the other concepts. So I think it works that way. The definition of a concept is its position in a system of other concepts. Like that. Let's go to literature then and talk about the three stages in literature. I think Derrida is not actually, he's not so much avant-garde as he is a classicist, a new classicist. And I'll relate it to ancient Greek culture. Not only philosophy, but also literature was deconstructive from its very beginning. The three stages of deconstruction can be described by the ancient Greek model of a literary work. In ancient theater, performances had two relevant features. Firstly, each one formed a life cycle from beginning to end. And secondly, each one commented on itself while it was in progress. So this is like the poem Fable too. A group of people called a chorus, who were also on stage, added extra information or explained the meaning. The cyclical structure is comprised of a strophe or turn, and antistrophe or counter turn, a turn to the first turn, and an epode or concluding event, 3 parts. The chorus explained what happened before the start of the play, commented on events during the middle, and explained the meaning of the entire work at its end. The chorus was a part of the performance because they moved on the stage, speaking either to the actors or to the audience. They moved in different directions across the stage to signal the strophe, the start, the antistrophe, the middle, or epode, the conclusion. In this way, starting in ancient Greek literature, some literary criticism, like a gray thread, was woven by the chorus into the works themselves, instead of being a separate kind of discourse, as is commonly thought today. Today we think that literary criticism is separate from literature, but that's not the way it started, and that's not the way it is in the very best works. The writer comments on his works within the text themselves. I have passages too. Throughout literary works, writers left threads of success and eventual failure for a successor to find. So a writer puts a GPS in the works, and new writers should try to find that GPS. Like the painting A Golden Thread, literary works develop through 3 stages, which can be called deconstruction. One complete example is Wordsworth's book-length autobiographical poem, The Prelude, or Growth of a Poet's Mind. It deconstructed Coleridge's poetry, developed in 3 stages, and was deconstructed by Percy Bysshe Shelley's poetry. And I have a figure for that too. I could add this, that notice the title of the work, The Prelude, or Growth of a Poet's Mind. So in his opinion, The primary purpose of poetry would be to develop oneself and develop other people, to increase the imagination. It would not be to solve social problems, although literature may do that, but that is not the primary purpose for some people. So the three stages of Wordsworth's poetry, and the main thing I want to show you here just is that it's like the three stages in philosophy. They're parallel, a parallel kind of development. So in the first stage, A is a criticism of Coleridge's poetry. In the appendix 2, you don't have it, but I include all of the lines in which Wordsworth quotes Coleridge, and it's very clear that he's criticizing Coleridge's poetry. And in B, he says, I can do it better, and here it is. And he gives us an example of poetry that's written in a new way, and it's better. What I like is that both occur together. They're like mirrors, A and B, a mirror of each other, which is exquisite. And then that occurs in Book 1 of Wordsworth's Prelude. Then in Book 6 of the Prelude, it's a pretty long poem. In Book 6 in the middle, Wordsworth criticizes his previous poetry. He says it's not good enough. And he gives the reason for that. But then he rewrites his poetry and he shows a new way of writing poetry, an improved way of writing poetry in B. And then in the last book of the Prelude, he criticizes the way he wrote before, and it's included in the poem there, the reflections, and he gives his final way, his best way of writing poetry. So it's a three-stage process. I have all the passages, but it would just take too long to look at words in these lines, those lines. It's quite a process. So it's a three-stage process too, like strophe, antistrophe, and epode, and it's like the three fates too. And what I'm suggesting to you today is that the narrow definition of deconstruction is step number 1, but the broader definition of deconstruction in the 1960s is all three stages, because what Wordsworth wants to do is to replace Coleridge's poetry. He wants to have a complete literary achievement. And you don't have a complete literary achievement until you have all three stages.
Did you try also to do it, for example, in architecture or painting? The stages?
I haven't tried to do it, but
because, for example, I'm thinking about the realism painting in the 19th century. And then came the Impressionism, Pointillism, and then one of the highest stages, the first work in 1907 of Picasso, who put inside of the painting different things. So I think in a way it's interesting also to see whether it would apply in painting than in sculpture with Brancusi and the English great sculpture, against Rodin or all these, images of concreteness. I think it would be interesting to see whether it could be.
Certainly, yeah. Thanks a lot for that. Yeah, that's exactly what I think too. I remember I was at the Tate in London. I saw a film about Picasso's life, and Picasso did something very interesting. After he developed his own style, he started to repaint previous masters in his own style to show that his style was superior to theirs. And he wasn't just trying to show off, he was trying to understand for himself too the relationship of his art to the previous art. And it was an improvement. It wasn't something completely different. He was developing the tradition, moving it forward. So Picasso is a good example, a very good example. And writers do that too. as we're going to see. The second main topic for today, besides deconstruction, is bricolage. When discussing, and I'll explain it, when discussing the ideas of Lévi-Strauss on the bricoleur, a person, Derrida expands the meaning of deconstruction from criticism to creation. And this is important for creative writers and any type of creators, I think, even in mathematics or physics. I know other examples, but we should go on. The bricoleur begins with existing materials only to use them for new purposes. Lévi-Strauss believes a creator borrows one's initial materials from the tradition, changing them and making new ones. Derrida agrees with Lévi-Strauss's contrast of the bricoleur with the engineer. The bricoleur and engineer are metaphors for creators with opposite attitudes toward their creative projects. Derrida does not think that a person, called an engineer, can create a new work out of nothing. I've had writing students before, and they said, isn't it good if we just write in a completely different way? And my answer to them is, it's good to be original, but what we want to do is improve on what already exists. So we want to develop. So we can't just write something that's completely different. We want to develop the tradition. Derrida creates like a bricoleur, not an engineer. When he started to create his own philosophy in his introduction to Edmund Husserl's Origin of Geometry, he used much of the same terminology and images of Husserl and Sartre. However, he used them for new purposes. Today we use the new word repurposing. For example, Sartre speaks about the image of an action that is both a destruction and a creation, which foreshadows a development of this idea as deconstruction. So Sartre gives an image of that. Sartre writes about a nuclear explosion at the heart of our being. And I quote Sartre here because I think it's pretty amazing about creation. One way one may be reminded here of that convenient fiction by which certain popularizers are accustomed to illustrate the principle of the conservation of energy. If they say a single one of the atoms which constitute the universe were annihilated, destroyed, there would result a catastrophe which would extend to the entire universe. And this would be, in particular, the end of the Earth and of the solar system. This metaphor can be of use to us here. The four itself is like a tiny annihilation. The four itself is the internal self of a person. The four itself is like a tiny annihilation, destruction, which has its origin at the heart of being. And this annihilation is sufficient to cause a total upheaval to happen to the in itself. I'll paraphrase that a little bit. I've been trying to avoid unusual technical terms. Sartre's text states that a creative act could change one's entire perspective, even one's identity or stylistic signature. I say this sometimes, that if you work a little bit and you create something or you're successful, you feel a change and you feel good. But if you work years for something and it's very difficult, then it moves you even more when you create something. You feel it stronger. So you feel the success of creativity more depending on how much effort you put into it. You can tell the strength of the spirit by its willingness to lose itself in its own activity. That's a quote from a 19th century philosopher. Derrida reinvents this image of a nuclear explosion as a metaphor for a creative act. So when Derrida talks about creation, he's talking about the most creative acts that human beings can engage in. And it's like an earthquake. when writing about the finding of more and more connections in a precursor's text and the attempts to revise the previous text by making new words, images, or ideas by analogy, he claims there can be creative success. He writes, this is Derrida, "This increase regularly produces a silent explosion of the whole text and introduces a kind of fissure, rather fission, one is separation, the other is going together, within each concept as well as each statement. The energy that is released is the increased power of a new writer. A new writer experiences an increase in power." Both Sartre and Derrida regarded a creative act as potentially an explosion, a life-changing event. Einstein confirms this feeling of creation as an overwhelming event, which at first disorients the creator. And this is a quote from Einstein. "It was as if the ground had pulled out from under one, with no firm foundation to be seen anywhere, upon which one could have built." So I mention this because my talk is directed to writers and other creators too. The ground that we stand on is like the presupposition of our literature. As a second example of bricolage by Derrida, in Being and Nothingness, Sartre presented the image of a writer at a desk, being observed by someone behind himself and knowing that he's being observed. It's really quite a striking image. Derrida revises or repurposes this image. So this is another example that Derrida is changing some things that he finds in Sartre's philosophy, and I have an image of it here. So this is quite a fine image. Derrida has a book called The Postcard, and the topic is creativity across generations. But this is very special. This image comes from a painting, a fortune-telling book. It's the frontispiece. It's an image that occurs at the beginning of the book, and the book is about fortune-telling. What you should be able to see in the image is that we have Socrates sitting down writing, and we have Plato on the left. Plato's behind him telling him what to write. This is special because Socrates never wrote anything. In the Platonic dialogues, Plato represents Socrates as a teacher. So the senior person, the older person, is Socrates, and the younger person is actually Plato. So in a sense, Plato is in Socrates' future. So we have this kind of influence. I wanted to develop this idea a little bit. Here, in the case of Derrida, Derrida is sitting down writing, and Sartre is telling him what to write. What I mean by this is that Derrida picks up clues from Sartre. This is bricolage because I mentioned this is the second image that Sartre used, and Derrida is using it in a new way. So Derrida is picking up clues from Sartre, and he's starting to write. But that's not the main meaning. Here's the second one. This is harder to understand. It's more unusual. When Derrida is formulating new concepts, what he's doing is he's showing that he can write some things better than Sartre. His concepts are better than Sartre's. His are a superior form of Sartre's. Originally, this paper was much longer, and I included examples from science. Einstein's theory of relativity is a superior form of Maxwell's physics. And what that means is that some of the laws seem to be sort of true, but Einstein made laws that are more accurate. So Maxwell's physics is sort of like a subsystem of Einstein's physics. So that's what I want to show here, that Derrida in a way is sort of telling Sartre what he should have written, but he didn't write. Derrida's philosophy is a superior form of Sartre's philosophy. And that happens in writing too. But this is really what the postcard shows. It shows the future. So in this case, I have Derrida sitting down writing again. He's finished his philosophy, but in the postcard, he's trying to imagine what his successor will say he should have written. He's trying to imagine how he's going to be corrected. He knows that someone's going to come along who's going to be better than him. And so he's trying to tell his own future. He's trying to do that. Not completely successful, but it's a good attempt. Let's go to bricolage in literature. The first step in bricolage is the change of the structural unconscious or limiting presupposition into a new start. These terms don't seem to apply to literature, but they do. Literary critics have described such creative processes. So literary critics do talk about this. It's not just me, it's not just Derrida. Todorov described how Henry James developed his writing from Flaubert's. And I quote, "For some time, James followed in Flaubert's path. But in the tales, in the short stories, James has gone a step further. He has become conscious of Flaubert's sensationalism, which means an excess or limitation of Flaubert's fiction. And instead of simply employing it as a means, he has made it the constructive principle of his work." So this means that James changed a problem into a new postulate. He tried to find something positive that Flaubert was not aware of. Todorov is describing an important phase in the deconstruction of a work, when the limiting presupposition or outside perspective point is transformed, changed into a better one. That's a very important part of deconstruction, that we just don't say something is wrong, but we find a way to make it better. This phase is an aspect of creation discussed by Goethe, the German poet. And I quote, "The greatest art in theoretical and practical life consists in changing the problem into a postulate. That way one succeeds. A creator must look at a predecessor's works in a new way, with a new perspective, by redefining some previous ideas." By the way, I just thought of something. I saw a show about Star Trek at one time, and they gave an examination to the new commanders, but no one could ever pass the test. That was a secret. So what James Kirk did is, he went in the night before and he changed the program so he could succeed. What this tells us is that you may not be able to ever solve the problem in the previous writer's works or in a previous philosophy. What you have to do is you have to change the game. This is a term from Lyotard too. You have to change the rules of the game or you can't win. You need to extend literature further. Change the game, not just a single rule. Todorov describes how the American fiction writer Henry James used irony or parody when developing his own style from that of Flaubert. Irony and parody occur through a double process of criticism and creation together. Bricolage is described in more detail by the literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. He explains how Fyodor Dostoevsky used images, characters, and situations from Nikolai Gogol's work by parodying them and giving them a new literary purpose. This is the best I've ever read of bricolage. A new great writer knows more about the style of a previous writer than that writer did. The new literary works can express the increased power of the imagination in two ways. Firstly, the works demonstrate greater knowledge about method. One writer knows more about literature than a previous writer, how to write it. Secondly, the works are more expressive of human feeling. Literature benefits people because they can perceive and express events in life more deeply. It is as if people are living more in the same amount of time. They're experiencing more deeply. For example, if an excellent writer and a person who is not are put in the same room and asked to describe it, the writer could convey much more information in the same number of words because the intensity of the imagination is greater, both perception and expression. I believe these effects of improvements in literature apply to fiction, poetry, and theater. In Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, Bakhtin explains the way that Dostoevsky shows his superior writing ability to that of Nikolai Gogol. Bakhtin uses a dialogic method from dialogue, in which the fiction is written as if a new writer is in dialogue with the previous one. This method is a way of including the consciousness or method of the previous writer. So one writer, in his new works, he includes the consciousness of the previous writer within the works themselves. I quote Bakhtin, "That which was presented in Gogol's field of vision as a collection of objective features in the literary text, merging into a profile of the hero, is introduced by Dostoevsky into the field of vision of the hero himself, and there becomes the object of his agonizing self-awareness. Even the very physical appearance of the poor clerk, described by Gogol, Dostoevsky forces his hero to contemplate in the mirror." Like Derrida's postcard, Plato behind Socrates, Gogol stands behind Dostoevsky, giving him advice, not all of which is accepted. Two voices, Gogol's and Dostoevsky's, can be heard speaking through Dostoevsky's early fiction at the same time, two voices together, like singers singing in harmony but with different parts. The part of Dostoevsky eventually becomes a solo. He develops a new style. Dostoevsky experiences a broadening and deepening of his understanding of human beings, along with a greater knowledge of the literary method of creation. His imagination has become strengthened, and he shows this stronger imagination. In my view, this dialogue of images, words, characters, situations, themes, which occurs through bricolage, is a literary example of Derrida's concept of difference. He presents difference as the ground for his new philosophy. So I tried to give a literary example of his philosophical concept of difference. It's pretty close. Derrida does give a literary example of différance in his short article about Kafka. To create a new work as an advancement of previous literature, to improve it, writers could become bricoleurs. So this is the second main idea for writers today, and I'll summarize it at the end. They could become apprentices of a master writer. The transformation occurs through step-by-step experimentation with style and method. Now, the third and main idea for creative writers is creation by analogy. This is more general and synthetic. According to Derrida, deconstruction is not a method for mechanically producing an improved literary work. When discussing the ideas of Condillac, the 18th century French philosopher, epistemologist, and Catholic priest, Derrida claims that a writer learns during attempts to create, during attempts to make a new kind of work based on analogy with a previous one. Creativity is not the result of an abstract theory. It's not the result, you can't just apply deconstruction It's not a mechanical formula for Derrida. He encourages the experimentation with literary elements, a trial and error approach, as described by Bakhtin. So the elements of literature would have a kind of chemical influence on each other. You might make one right, and you have to test another to see if it goes with it well. So there's kind of a chemistry there, chemical experimentation. Historians of science have studied solution modeling, which is based on creation through analogies. There's a man named Clifford Truesdell, and he describes similarities in the solutions proposed by successive theories in physics after Sir Isaac Newton. He says that they make their solutions in the same kind of way, many of them. In other words, someone can create by analogical extrapolation or extension, revising a predecessor's work as a predecessor had revised a previous one. The revision produces a new sense of direction based on analogy with the past. Derrida presents specific evidence about creativity which I will apply to literature. Firstly, a writer can redefine literature by understanding the unity of a predecessor's work better than the predecessor did. So Derrida does say in the book on Condillac that the first step is to start unifying all the different elements of a previous writer's works, seeing their relationships. Already, this process begins to be creative because it makes connections and new meanings unknown to the author. Secondly, a new writer needs to become aware of the path or trajectory of the predecessor's literary work and to try to follow an analogous but not identical one. So there's a path of literature. The analogy gives a direction to creation, but it cannot yet disclose the structure of the final work. So I have some images here. And the title is Creation in Philosophy by Solution Modeling, Analogical Extrapolation or Extension. And here I have Jean-Paul Sartre, I have Derrida, his philosophy, and I have Lyotard. And here, the main point is these two arrows, this arrow and this arrow, because here we have Derrida's solution to Sartre's philosophy, but here we have Lyotard's. So Lyotard actually solves a problem in Derrida's philosophy because he knew how it developed and he knew how a philosophy starts. So he tries to do the same thing, similar thing, to what his predecessor did. So we learn how to do it, but we have to do it in a different way. That's creation by analogy. We don't reject the past, we develop it. And I have another image there. It's just the two arrows I wanted to show you. That Lyotard can make this arrow because Derrida made that arrow. And this figure shows that the same thing happens in literature. And now let's move it down a little bit then. So we have two arrows again. We have this arrow, we have that arrow. And Shelley was able to improve upon Wordsworth's philosophy because Shelley knew how this development occurred, and Shelley knew how Wordsworth changed Coleridge's poetry. So we have a repetition, but it's not a repetition of the same. T.S. Eliot used to say, we have to find the form again. And in The Wasteland, he finds that there's a wasteland, but he has to renew the imagination. This process of analogical extrapolation or extension is like putting together a big jigsaw puzzle with many pieces, having irregular shapes and varied colors. I'm trying to give an ordinary life analogy for solution modeling. It is hard enough when someone has the box with the image of the completed puzzle on it. I don't know, probably most of you have put together giant puzzles. They come in a big box and there's a photograph or a painting on the top. It is hard enough when someone has the box with the image of the completed puzzle on it. But think of how difficult it would be for you if you do not have the image of the completed puzzle yet. How difficult it would be to put all those pieces together. In the case of literature or philosophy, you can't have the completed image. You can't have the painting or the photograph. It does not exist yet. You have to make it. A new writer, as a bricoleur, revises some pieces of the puzzle left by a predecessor, designs some new pieces that never existed before, and fits them together, sometimes in new ways. So the new writer makes a new painting on the box. This is the new improved vision of literature itself. It's better. It is made possible by remembering the trajectory of the predecessor's art, as if the predecessor is standing behind you, helping you get a sense of direction. From these comparisons of Derrida's philosophy and literature, I can offer some advice for writers and other creators. I had some other images here of solution modeling, but it's not really an image, it's not really visual. What I wanted to show you that it's not just a few words. You could find many, many different lines and compare them, and I put those passages in the appendix. What I could just say here is that you find pairs of passages. They're matching. You have a new kind of poetry and you have a criticism of previous poetry. It's like the mirror. And we speak about figures of speech, metonymy, metaphor, synecdoche, all those figures of speech. But actually, there are general figures, general pattern in literature that most people don't talk about. And Henry James does in The Figure in the Carpet, a short story, a meta-literature, that there's a giant pattern in there. It's invisible to many people, but it's there. So Henry James talks about it. So here are the recommendations based on Derrida's principles, which I described, I did not prove. Derrida did not intend to give advice to creative writers when he presented his new philosophy in the 1960s. His system of thought is much more general, and it applies to architecture, painting, and other fields too. So I think he would recommend that you deconstruct the work of a previous writer in 3 phases. First, you find the structural, unconscious, or implicit law of construction and revise it. It's not true that you only find it, you have to partially make it too. It never existed. Secondly, you could become a bricoleur and start experimenting, inventing. And then 3, create according to solution modeling, analogical extrapolation or extension. This means that you would need to know the trajectory of the previous writing career, how the previous writer developed. And here's my conclusion. At first, it may seem to be regrettable that literary works are programmed, doomed to end in problems. Stated in a more positive way, literary works prepare the ground for even better ones. So this is the natural course of things. In my opinion, this is the best possible solution. If literary works are meant to develop us, and we do develop from existing ones, then new works would be needed to develop us or the next generation even further. So many writers explicitly say that the purpose of my literature is to strengthen the imagination, make us better, and we can be more effective in life too, and live a fuller life. This view makes sense because it gives literature a place in the continuing development of human civilization. Ultimately, literature is an evolutionary force. Derrida's deconstruction suggests to creative writers that they are strengthening the imagination and that they will inspire others to surpass them, strengthening it even more. In the words of the great 20th century philosopher of culture, Ernst Cassirer, a cultural work is not an artifact with an unchanging meaning and influence. It is a passage from one perspective to a better one. To continue to improve life, literature kindles a new work. It means start a fire. To kindle means to start a fire. Like the red and yellow phoenix bird coming to life again from the ashes. The poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley, calls for other writers to be kindled by his work. And these are lovely lines, so I'll quote these from Shelley. Scatter as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth, the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? So he's calling for other writers to improve upon his writing. That's the end of what I wanted to present today. I want to thank you very much for inviting me to share ideas with you. I don't know if we have time for discussion, but I would like to. And I hope that these ideas might be helpful to writers and other creators too, or people interested in Derrida too. Thank you very much. That's all.
We thank very much Professor Schultz for his very interesting and clear lecture. I have already several questions.
Okay.
Maybe I'm going to limit myself and give also the floor to others.
Uh-huh.
When I give the floor, I give also the microphone. I would want to ask you if you think there is a relationship between the work of Oswald Spengler, The Decline of the West, Sartre and Derrida looking at it, because Oswald Spengler's work appeared around the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
It had to do also with the depression because of the war and everything. That would be one thing.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing, there were some assertions about superior, better, and so on. I have some doubts personally about evolution in writing from the point of view of certain quality. The one is superior, the one has a better, and so on. Wouldn't it be better to have another perspective than a better perspective upon different things, even if it relates to a certain literary current or things like that? And I also hate personally the word of progress in art.
Mm-hmm.
I don't consider that art in a way or the other makes a progress and one is superior to the other, but I rather think in a difference, as you said there. Also it was for me, I remember when I had the philosophy course, a very interesting thing that Sartre's attitude towards the nuclear bomb that triggered off this nihilist philosophy, when we all had the conscience that we can destroy not only a territory but the whole world. And I don't know whether the younger generation knows, but this way of philosophy was expressed by him and his adherents by dressing in total black. Today there are very many youngsters who think it's hip, but they don't know where this fashion came from and what lies behind it.
Okay, that's quite a bit. I'll try to remember everything and comment on it. In the first case, you said, could I comment on Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West? And does it have a relationship to Sartre's philosophy and Derrida's? Well, in general terms, Spengler describes a kind of cycle of civilizations, especially the West, that it would rise and that it would fall again. That's all that I know about his work. I know that Ernst Cassirer commented upon his works as mythological in a sense, because he uses many images there, and so he says that it's not as discursive as some other kinds of writing about civilization. And Sartre, originally I included it, but I cut it out. Sartre has a wonderful passage in Being Nothingness where he describes the fact that no one can solve his problem with a special concept of his, that it's unsolvable, and it is. And so that shows us that he has a sense of his own decline, that he was very successful, but his philosophy can't solve everything and it's coming to an end. So he has a sense there of rise and decline too. And Derrida does too. Derrida has a very clear sense that someone's going to be better than he is and someone's going to solve the problems in there. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, I'm not sure I remember it, but I do remember.
Better progress.
Yeah, that. Okay. That's Suzanne Langer, the best, she or Hannah Arendt, best female philosopher of the 20th century in the West, said that art never improves. Beauty is always beauty. So you were thinking of that too. I do think that some of the philosophies of the past, they seem so perfect that I don't like to describe that other philosophies were superior to them. But as I wrote here at the end, it's good if we say that a corpus, a body of literary works, is better than a previous one, that it changes. It's good, the change is good, because what it means is that the purpose of literature is to strengthen us and move us forward. So if these literary works change us and we move forward, then there have to be new literary works to move people forward even more, to continue the change. So in that sense, it would be very good if literary works became better and better. But I have another example, and this...
Immanuel Kant says that art is a finality without scope.
Mm-hmm.
Because he considered that it was a failure, his try after his ontology, gnoseology, to try to make to extend his system to aesthetics.
Mm-hmm. If we make analogies, it's easier to talk about progress in art or literature, because almost everyone would be willing to admit that there's progress in science. Can't we do so much more with science today than we could with science in the past? We can. For example, the theory of relativity. We can't have a GPS if we don't have the theory of relativity. The reason is that there's a big distance between your car and a satellite in outer space. So it would not be accurate enough unless you have calculations from the theory of relativity. So you see that science changes our daily life. It makes us more powerful. But I do admit it's more difficult to see in the case of literature. However, I do think it occurs. We could take an intermediary step between science and art, or science and literature. Take language. Linguists talk about the development of language. That there was a tribe found in the Philippines, and their language consisted of 300 words. What can you say with 300 words? It's true that adults can express more than children because they have a much larger vocabulary. It's very important for expression and perception too. But here's a topic I didn't have time to speak about. Let's look at the case of children this is about your question, it really is. Children learn language from the parents. And by the age 3.5, children have a basic sense of grammar in their language. And they learn it very quickly, like in 2 or 3 years. However, they have learned the basic structure of grammar that took 6,000 years to develop, but they get it in 2 or 3 years. And the parents are amazed that the children can form new combinations, and they've never been taught that. The reason is that the rules are implicit in the elements of language. What this shows is that there's a transference of knowledge from one generation to the next. And the transference of knowledge is not through the quantity of elements, but it's through the manner of formation. So the children learn some correct expressions, they know how to make some things, and then they can make new ones by themselves. So I think if we look at language, we can say that there has been an increase in human abilities. There have been progress in language. Languages have become much larger, and the grammar has become much more developed. If you learn a foreign language, they have various levels of learning foreign languages. At the very basic level, the thoughts are small. The thoughts are short. The thoughts are not very connected. You can't use complex subordinate conjunctions or connectors. If you look at the compositions of children, they're just a series of thoughts, and they're small. But as you move through the development of linguistic knowledge, you have a greater variety of connections and more complex connections. You can express thoughts that children can't express. So this increase in the number of relationships and the topics that can be spoken about, this shows that there's a development in language itself, and historically, it's analogous to the development of language in history too. So we can see progress in language, we can see progress in science. I know it's harder in literature and art to talk about progress. I think ancient art is beautiful, a lot of it. I think so. And music too. And philosophies too. I still think they're just fantastic, some of the ancient philosophies. I do.
If somebody wants to take the microphone, please, so it can be recorded and become immortal.
Mrs. Ioannidis.
I don't know.
Mrs. Ioannidis. Do you want to?
I don't know. I thank you very much for
Step one more.
listen. No, I didn't really have a question. I only wanted to thank very much because we have new perspectives due to you.
Yes.
And to Derrida. And if we start more discussions, it would take a day and 3 and 2. You know, this is a very open proposal of discussion. So really, I don't think we can do it.
Well, thank you. I wanted to offer something that was valuable. And I have been to many conferences in different countries. And the best thing that I could hope for many times is just to hear something new.
I think it would be an extraordinary instrument for those who go to creative writing programs, because your standard, what you propose here, is really very interesting and goes far.
Derrida thinks that he changed the entire history of philosophy, and writers think that they changed the entire tradition of literature too. And it sounds pompous, it sounds elitist, but this is related to Peter's question. They actually performed some evolution for human civilization by changing the way we imagine and think. So.
I would say nevertheless that I am also of the opinion that one cannot draw a line of progress. Could anyone say that Henry James is superior to Flaubert just in general? Maybe there are some features, there are some transformations. There is another attuning to the reality around. In the end, you do not always create from other books, although nothing is new under the sun. You will have some wavelengths towards your own life and issues of the moment. So,
I know what you mean, and
you know,
many people would think the same thing.
What freshman would accept it, you know.
Yeah, they're both wonderful and very great.
Yes, they are exceptional.
Yeah.
And look, Bertrand Russell wrote a whole book of Western philosophy where he only found that maybe Spinoza was bringing something new, but all the rest were in the lap of the ancient Greeks. And so because we are with Greek people around here, you know, that doesn't mean that it is really true exactly in this way. But
yeah, they're both great, so why should we want to say that one is better than the other? Yeah.
So,
I like the classics.
The Latin said, de gustibus et de coloribus non disputandum. It was a very popular saying that, but we may draw some conclusions. I wanted to ask you, why do you think that Derrida started in the 60s? Was it a period of upheaval, of changes and so on? Because you said the foundation was 1967.
It was because of his publications. The introduction to Edmund Husserl's Origin of Geometry, it was 1960, and then he had his structuralism essay, which he delivered in America, and he became friends with the literary critics in America in 1966. In 1967, he published the trilogy of Grammatology and Writing and Difference and Speech and Phenomena. So if you have the books from 1967, you could become a great philosopher from those books alone. It's true that he continued after that time. So it's because of his publications. That's why I say the 1960s.
So you were, in a way, at a period after you were a student, when you came in contact in the American University, as Bogdan Ghiu said, with his philosophy, who was teaching there?
Derrida had already published in some very good French journals, but he became famous after 1966. One way you become famous is that people who are already famous say that you're famous. So that happened to him, that part of the path.
But I have a question related to that. How the Anglo-Saxon world discovered Derrida? I mean, was it very French for the academic environment at that time of 60s? Was it his philosophy? Was sounding his philosophy as very French? I had always this question because it is really Derrida's philosophy. It is really a French oriented, French style philosophy, and it comes from this philosophical tradition. So I was always wondering what was this point that the Anglo-Saxon world discovered as a fundamental one and became famous in the academic environment of the United States at that time.
Yeah, we could speak for hours about that. There's a very good article by a Princeton sociology analyzing how Derrida became famous. And he didn't become famous, as Peter mentioned in what you read, originally from philosophers. He became famous with literary critics. And why was that the case? That was the case that he wouldn't be competitors then with other philosophers. The other philosophers wouldn't naturally say, oh, you're better than me, okay, go ahead. It's a competition. But also, as you rightly mentioned, most philosophy in America, in the Anglo-Saxon word, is different from Derrida's kind of philosophy. It's called a language philosophy, analytic philosophy. And there is a kind of warfare or competition between analytic philosophers and Derrida's style. And it's so severe that there were even some negative obituaries of Derrida. Usually that doesn't happen, that you start criticizing someone, they just died. Usually that doesn't happen. Even negative obituaries, and Oxford, was it Oxford or Cambridge, the philosophers wouldn't give him the honorary doctorate, but the literary critics would. So he wasn't received positively by philosophers in the Anglo-Saxon world. Because of the type of philosophy that they have, that's one reason. But why did he become famous with literary critics? Well, he made some high-level friends from the very beginning in 1966. He was a handsome man too. And more important than that was that there is a certain market in America for importing foreign culture. And it's a limited market, but he just fit perfectly into that market.
And he was invited at universities to lecture, no?
Yes.
And that gave him a platform in order to be better known.
Mm-hmm.
And probably youngsters were interested in it, and maybe you were one of the ones who were. As a matter of fact, you should say that he personally met several times Derrida,
yes,
and that Derrida very much appreciated the works that he did, the bibliography and comparison, that books that he wrote. So he was in a very near relationship to Derrida, and not only to Derrida.
I have photographs, but I don't like those photographs, and
Well, I can say
I have letters. Yeah.
because I was present there. But Derrida turns to Bill Schultz and said that my book, the bibliography that Bill Schultz prepared for him is my Bible. And it's very hard for somebody to say that, and it's rare. So I'm not just saying it, but to add to this. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I love to talk about these topics. I'd love to find out your ideas. Peter, I wanted to add this. When I talked to Derrida before, I was surprised about how practical he was about his career. I mean, he realized that to some degree you have to promote yourself. Maybe you don't want to do too much. I mean, you should be good too, but he was practical about developing his fame.
But why so many? You said that, of course, there were so many who loved him, or somebody who liked him, but there were somebody who were totally against him. For example, I can tell you that a good friend of mine, and the one who initiated the retranslation of the works of Shakespeare, George Volchanov and the group, he said he won't come because he can't stand him.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But where does this hate, this total rejection come from? From some.
Yeah.
He's not a philosopher, he's a translator.
Yes. It reminds me of some theories of racism. One theory I read of racism is that the reason people are racist is not that they want to attack the other people. It's for the unity of their own group. So that would be the primary reason. A kind of cult and primitive unity of their own group. That's the primary purpose of racism. So that might be one reason for attacking Derrida. I could say this, though, that even Foucault was jealous of Derrida's fame. Foucault was the better lecturer in France. Everyone went to his lectures because he was talking about sex and criminals, and he's a very colorful figure, Foucault. But Derrida's lectures, not that exciting. But Derrida became much more famous. But Foucault said this about Derrida, that he's I don't have the phrase quite right, but he's a terrorist obscure terrorist. He combined the two words terrorist and obscure writer. So one reason, and other writers too, like Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is an excellent intellectual. I mean, linguist, he's marvelous. But he had some very harsh criticism for Derrida, and it's unlikely that he understood his ideas. And the reason...
On his linguistic philosophy.
Yeah. And the reason would be that they don't think it means anything because they can't understand it. And the reason... They assume that because he uses words, that it should be easy to understand. But what they don't understand is that there's a code of meaning, a code of creation of the special terms, and a code of their combination, like there is in chemistry. If you didn't know how the symbols are made, if you didn't know how the symbols are related, you can't understand anything. There is a special code in philosophy too, as there is in literature and other fields. So they don't even know that that exists, and so that's why they say he's obscure. That you can't just read it as ordinary language. You have to decode it, as if you're studying chemistry.
Yeah. What about the concept of deconstruction related to the concept of postmodernism? Because very often it has been confused. And as you very well mentioned, many times today, deconstruction means nothing. Yeah. It has been a concept without meaning. But this is not because of Derrida, of course, but because of the use of the word deconstruction. So, many people, I don't share this opinion, but many philosophers and analysts, they think that postmodernism is something like deconstruction to the modernism, to the modernity. Mm-hmm. So, and it gives a kind of relativism to the meaning. Mm-hmm. So, this kind of relativism, could we say that it has something to do with I don't agree, but anyway, I'm obliged to mention it. That has something to do with Derrida's philosophy of deconstruction, because in fact, deconstruction for Derrida is a kind of reconstruction. So, should you mention something about this relation, postmodernism and deconstruction?
Okay, I hope I can...
Ihab Hassan, 1972, his essay, Postmodernism. Ihab Hassan has written, I think, 7 or 8 pages where he puts the basis of what postmodernism is, 1972, compared to 66, 67, it's very near, one to the other.
Yes. I wanted to ask Derrida once about what you think, did Lyotard really improve upon your philosophy? But I thought I shouldn't go that far, so I didn't ask him. He did tell me I'm the last person who would want to see the end of deconstruction. He did tell me that. Anyway, I hope I can respond to your question directly. I do think, I spoke about this once at a world conference of philosophy, that I do think that Lyotard improved upon Derrida's philosophy. They knew each other, and they went to conferences together. So I do think it's an improvement upon it, and that he solved a problem at the end of his philosophy. Concerning postmodernism, Lyotard didn't make the terms so that people could understand them very easily. But Derrida's term deconstruction is a masterstroke. It's really genius to make that term deconstruction because it's so close to ordinary language, but it's different. So it can be spread very easily and widely. So he might have known that. But postmodernism is not really a term that can be spread easily because it means something very unusual. Postmodernism doesn't, and Lyotard writes this in his book about what is postmodernism. It's a short, long essay. He says it doesn't mean after modernism, postmodernism. It means the stage that would be superior to modernism. And he's talking about how can we try to think of those concepts that are superior to the ones that we presently have. That's what he's looking for. Plato talked about this too. Plato said the greatest science in human life is to try to determine what thoughts our present thoughts depend upon, what they would develop into, to try to think of something better. Plato said that, but postmodernism is concerned with that. What does our present thinking depend on? What will our present thinking develop into? So postmodernism refers to a priori concepts, the ones that are before our present ones. And so Lyotard is talking about that, I think.
Thank you.
So I think because there are already 2 hours and so on, we could continue. We could invite Professor Schultz maybe here to have a more complex lecture, maybe a week or something. But we must put an end to our endeavors in understanding deconstruction, postmodernism, avant-gardism, modernism, and so on. And thank you all for, thank you first, William Schultz, for giving us this beautiful lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.